Some deaths pass like a quiet wind, and others poison the air around them. The death of Henry VIII, England's most feared, most married, and most monstrous king, was not a passing. It was an infection, as his enormous corpse lay decaying inside the cold stone walls of Whitehall Palace. Servants choked on the stench. Courtiers whispered behind scented handkerchiefs. And England's throne stood on the edge of a silent war. But the worst part wasn't the smell. The worst part was the lie. Henry was dead. And for 3 entire days, no one dared to say it out loud. They burned incense. They posted guards. They prayed and schemed in shadows. But they did not speak the words, because the truth could crack the crown before it passed to a child king's trembling hands. But this story didn't begin with death. It began with a prince as beautiful as any painted angel. A man whose legs had danced through jousts, whose voice had sung in 6 languages, and whose charm had once turned the heads of queens across Europe. That golden boy vanished beneath layers of rage, desperation, and rot. He cracked his skull in a joust. He couldn't walk without pain. His legs oozed open sores. His breath stank of decay. His flesh turned yellow. He grew to nearly 400 pounds. And somewhere in all of that meat and misery, the real Henry Proud, clever, magnetic, was eaten alive by his own body. By the coldest weeks of January in the year 1547, the King of England no longer resembled a man. His body was a battlefield of disease. His mind a maze of ghosts and morphine. Those who entered his sick room didn't find royalty. They found a horror show. The bed was draped in black velvet. The candles smoked. The air was thick with rotting sweetness, barely masked by burning herbs. When the king moved, he screamed, and those screams echoed down Whitehall's stone corridors at night, terrifying the same men who had once knelt at his feet. Doctors applied everything from boiled onions to crushed human skulls to the ulcers on his legs. They smeared on gold. They bled him with leeches. They even pressed half-dead pigeons to his skin. None of it worked. The only thing that dulled the agony was opium. But the drug made him see things, made him cry out for Anne Boleyn, whisper to Jane Seymour, call out for Thomas More with trembling lips. Some said he spoke to ghosts. Others said the ghosts were just names. Either way, the king began to fade into a cloud of agony and visions, slipping between lucidity and madness like a man drowning in his own blood. And still, the court played its final, deadliest game, because in the center of this nightmare lay a prize, a pale little boy named Edward, just 9 years old, the only son Henry had ever managed to keep alive. With the king rotting, 2 factions sharpened their knives. The Catholics, led by the old Duke of Norfolk. The Protestants, led by Edward Seymour, uncle to the child king, even as his hands trembled too violently to hold a pen. Henry signed Norfolk's death warrant. He did not forgive, not even at the end. Death came in waves. First, a seizure that left him paralyzed on one side, then the collapse of his lungs. When the Archbishop of Canterbury asked if the king still placed his faith in Christ, Henry could no longer speak. He squeezed the Archbishop's hand. Faintly, one final gesture that would later be turned into Protestant propaganda proof. They claimed of a deathbed conversion. But what truly passed through Henry's mind at that moment, no one knows. Only the walls of that cursed room could answer. What followed was a conspiracy of silence. The king's death was kept secret for 3 full days. No bell tolled. No decree was issued. And in that silence, Edward Seymour struck. He locked down the palace, secured the forts, called secret meetings, eliminated rivals. By the time London learned their king had died, a new protector stood behind the throne, and a boy in mourning sat on it. Meanwhile, Henry's body turned monstrous. It swelled. It leaked. It split the lead-lined coffin and spilled fluids onto the chapel floor. Dogs licked the puddle. Servants fainted. The embalming team panicked. They cut out his organs, stuffed his body with spices, and still the stench could not be silenced. His coffin had to be twice the size of a normal noble's and required extra men to carry. At the funeral, they displayed effigies of the king, as he once was broad-shouldered, fierce-eyed, godlike. But inside the box, just rot, bone, fluid, gas, the collapse of a myth. The aftermath was swift and brutal. His sixth wife, Katherine Parr, married her secret love within weeks. His daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, were thrust into danger. One would almost lose her head. The other would lose her freedom. As for the mighty will, Henry had written 30 pages dictating the future. It was undermined within days. Edward Seymour made himself Lord Protector and ignored the council Henry had carefully arranged. Even in death, the king was powerless to control what came next. He had ordered a grand tomb with bronze statues and a towering image of himself on horseback. It was never completed. The statues were later melted down during a civil war. No monument, no glory. Just a sealed vault beneath Windsor's stone floor, and a smell that no one ever forgot. What remained of Henry VIII was not majesty, not greatness, not fear. What remained was a stench, the stench of flesh, of betrayal, of power turned to pus. And above it all, the eerie silence of a kingdom pretending that its god-king hadn't just died, drowning in his own rot. There are certain kinds of pain that don't just hurt, they hum. They grow teeth. They learn your name. And they come back every night, like a faithful dog. For Henry VIII, pain became his closest companion. Not his wives, not his son, not the council of nobles who bowed before him, but agony. And it lived in his legs. The sores didn't just open, they rotted. They didn't just rot, they howled. And long before death came to take him, Henry had already begun to dissolve from the bottom up. It started, they say, with the joust. In the year 1536, a charging horse, a shattered lance, and a crushed leg changed everything. He was carried off the field unconscious. For 2 hours he didn't breathe, and the kingdom whispered that the king was dead. But he woke. He lived, and something inside him stayed broken. From that day onward, his body turned traitor. He could no longer ride without pain. His legs swelled. The skin cracked. Boils bubbled. The ulcers festered. And worst of all, they never closed. Doctors gathered around him like flies. They wrapped the legs in linen, soaked in wine, then vinegar, then honey, then pus-thick concoctions made from flowers, blood, ground pearls, and bile. They opened the wounds again and again, trying to release the bad humours. But the pain grew worse. At night, Henry would scream so loudly that guards posted outside his chambers winced. Some fled. One collapsed. And with the pain came the fear. Fear that the leg would have to be amputated. Fear that infection would reach the bone. Fear that England would see their king limp. Hobble. Collapse. So Henry hid. He stopped walking in public. They built machines to hoist him from bed to chair. Then from chair to throne. He wore long robes to hide the swelling, but the stench crept out anyway. It seeped through fabric, through perfumes. Through the layers of lies, the court told each other about how well he looked. One foreign ambassador described the odor as sickly sweet rot. Another said it was the smell of death pretending to be alive. Physicians took to stuffing their nostrils with mint-soaked cloth. Servants carried incense in silver bowls. Windows were thrown open, even in winter. And still, the smell lingered. But Henry didn't just rot on the outside. Inside, his organs turned against him. His appetite ballooned. He consumed meals meant for 5 men, washing down haunches of meat with gallons of wine. His liver swelled. His kidneys failed. his heart strained to beat beneath layers of fat and infection. The king who once danced with queens could barely climb 3 steps without gasping. By the early months of 1547, his face was yellow, his hands swollen, his breath shallow. His legs had grown so ulcerated that bone was visible through blackened flesh. Still, he gave orders. Still, he signed death warrants. Still, he lashed out at anyone who displeased him. Pain made him crueler. Madness made him unpredictable. Some days, he sat in silence for hours, staring into the fire, mumbling the names of the dead Anne, Thomas, Catherine, others. He erupted in fury over a misplaced paper or an improperly cooked pheasant, and servants would flee from the sound of his voice. They tried everything: leeches, boiled roots, burned feathers, crushed emeralds dissolved in honey. One physician suggested pressing the corpses of small birds cut in half directly onto the ulcers. They tried it. It did nothing. Henry screamed so loudly, the guards outside fell to their knees. Another doctor dared to suggest fasting. He was dismissed within the hour. One even recommended spiritual penance. Henry had him whipped for heresy. Eventually, the physicians settled on 2 things: opium to numb the pain, and silence to protect the kingdom. Henry's body was breaking, but no one was allowed to say it out loud. Not the doctors, not the nobles, not even his wife, Katherine Parr, his 6th and final queen, was rarely allowed into the royal chamber during these final months. When she did visit, it was behind layers of incense, through a haze of smoke. In brief intervals, when Henry's mind was clear enough to recognize her, she came dressed in black. She spoke softly. She left quickly. But others, his chaplains, his closest courtiers, began to notice something more terrifying than the smell. Henry was hallucinating. He claimed he saw shadows at the foot of his bed. Once, he said, Anne Boleyn was sitting beside him, watching him sleep. Another night, he screamed that Thomas More had returned to drag him to hell. One attendant recorded in his diary that the king woke crying, begging forgiveness. And then, the next morning, he denied it all. Between the ulcers and the ghosts, Henry began to unravel. His signature grew shaky, his commands contradictory. One day, he demanded Catholic Mass. The next, he ordered Protestant prayers. He wrote new additions to his will, then crossed them out. He insisted Edward be crowned at his bedside, then demanded the boy be sent away. Everyone around him walked on broken glass. One misstep could mean exile or worse. By mid-January, the king could no longer stand. He could barely eat. Every movement sent tremors of pain through his bloated frame. A team of 10 servants worked around the clock to clean him, lift him, dress his wounds, and catch the blood that seeped through his bandages. The palace chambermaids whispered that death was already in the room, that it waited in the corner, silent and patient, smelling like rosemary and old meat. And yet, Henry fought. He screamed at the doctors to save him. He threatened to execute the next man who said the word death. He barked at Cranmer that the will must be followed exactly, every clause, every comma, or else. But the truth was already taking shape in the eyes of his inner circle. The king was dying, and no throne, no crown, no bloodline could stop it. As the final week arrived, Henry fell into a near-constant state of delirium. Sometimes he muttered prayers. Sometimes he cursed his own name. Sometimes he was silent for hours, his breathing ragged, his skin the color of old parchment. It was then, in that silence, that the true kingdom took form, a place not of palaces, but of shadows, a place where a once mighty king lay drowning in himself, bloated, broken, and haunted. And somewhere far away, the bells of London waited. They waited for the command to toll. But for now, they were silent, because the king, though nearly gone, was still listening. There are rooms in history where time stops, not because they are sacred, or grand, or remembered in paintings, but because what happened inside them can never be undone. Henry VIII died in one such room, a room whose windows faced the grey Thames, whose floors were soaked in candle wax and human fluids, whose silence was more violent than any scream. In that room, surrounded by physicians, too frightened to speak, and attendants too loyal to run, England's most terrifying monarch died slowly. Not with a roar, not with a proclamation, but with the sound of breath turning shallow, the pulse slipping, and a single hand barely able to squeeze goodbye. The final days were not quiet. They were filled with dread, restraint, and a kind of terror that did not come from blood, but from waiting. The year was 1547. The month was January, and the king's body had become unrecognizable. His skin was yellow-grey, stretched over swelling. His legs had been consumed by ulcers, the bone visible through gaping sores. His stomach bulged grotesquely beneath silk nightshirts, already stained with pus. The bed massive, dark, draped in velvet, reeked of death. The walls were hung with holy relics and thick tapestries to keep out the cold. But nothing could keep out the smell. Only a few were allowed into the chamber by that point. Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, was chief among them. He was not there for medicine. He was there for the soul. When summoned, he walked with measured steps through the corridors, past guards who looked away, past courtiers who whispered behind gloved hands, until he reached the door. And behind that door lay not a king, but something between flesh and shadow. Cranmer found the king lying still, one eye swollen shut, the other open but unfocused. The body barely moved. Every breath was an effort. Henry had stopped speaking hours before, following a seizure so violent that 5 men had to restrain him. The fit left his right side paralyzed. His lips hung open. His jaw twitched. The physicians, desperate not just for a cure, but for survival, resorted to burning irons, bitter potions, and whispered prayers. They knew failure could mean disgrace, or the scaffold. When Cranmer approached the bed, he knelt, he whispered the last rites, and then he asked the question history would immortalize. "Do you place your trust in Christ?" Henry could not answer, but he squeezed the Archbishop's hand faintly, weakly. Once, that squeeze would be claimed by Protestants as a sign of spiritual clarity. Catholics would call it a lie. But in that room, with no pen, no sword, no court left to command, it was the last gesture Henry ever made. The king slipped into a coma shortly after. His breathing grew erratic. At times he stopped altogether, the chamber holding its breath with him. Servants changed his linens twice each hour. They rotated perfumed cloths near his face. Incense burned in heavy silver basins. A priest murmured Latin under his breath. Outside the room, guards stood with spears, unaware that their sovereign was already more ghost than man. Katherine Parr, his wife, had not been permitted into the room for 2 days. She waited, dressed in mourning black, pacing a separate chamber, denied even the comfort of speaking to the man who had once made her queen. Edward, the son Henry, had torn England apart to create, was kept away entirely. He would not see his father alive again. The child played with books and tutors, while England's most powerful corpse was already forming in the room next door. Cranmer remained beside the bed. He did not leave. The physicians consulted one another in whispers. The king's chest rose less and less often, and when it stopped altogether, no one spoke, no one cried, no one rang a bell, because the king was dead, but the world was not ready to know. The moment Henry VIII died was not marked by ceremony, not even by prayer. It was marked by a terrible stillness. And then, By movement, swift, secret, political, men ran not to grieve, but to control. Thomas Wriothesley, the Lord Chancellor, ordered the Royal Council assembled in silence. Edward Seymour, the boy king's uncle, began locking doors. Messages were sent. Gates were sealed. Fortresses were claimed. The king's body, still warm, had not even been washed when the first alliances were formed in its shadow. Outside the chamber, the court continued to behave as if Henry still lived. Orders were delivered in his name. Decrees issued meals sent to his rooms. Untouched, the courtiers bowed toward his door. But inside, the king was cooling fast, his skin turning to marble, his eyes sealed by the hands of a trembling priest. For 3 days, the body lay hidden from the world. Servants wept silently while changing blood-soaked cloths. Doctors covered their faces. The lead-lined coffin was prepared. Its dimensions double the size of a nobleman's. Perfumes were stuffed into every corner of the room. The windows remained open, even as snow drifted in, because the scent could not be masked. And still, no one said a word to the people. January the 28th. That was the day he died. But the bells of London did not toll until January the 31st. 3 days. 3 days of silence. 3 days of lies. And by the time the kingdom learned their king had died, his son had already been crowned in secret. The council had already changed hands. The Seymour faction had already claimed control. The body was cold. But the power was already burning in someone else's grasp. When the announcement was finally made, it came not as a shock, but as a sound. The bells rang out, low and heavy, and all across England, people wept or they rejoiced. Some whispered that the tyrant was gone. Others clutched their children in fear of what came next. Priests lit candles. Nobles scrambled for favour. And in Windsor, a tomb waited to be filled. But inside Whitehall, behind closed doors, a corpse still sat in its bed, leaking. The linens were changed again, the eyes sealed again. The room, once so full of voice and threat and heat, had gone completely quiet. The lion was dead, but no one dared to breathe just yet. When Kingsday, we imagine incense, choir, velvet-draped processions, and the hush of reverence. But when Henry VIII died, he leaked. His body, bloated by infection and rot, turned against him even in death. His flesh, so swollen that it tore through linen and silk, began to rupture before the carpenters could even finish the coffin. And in the dark, perfumed chamber of Whitehall Palace, the most feared man in England became something no one dared describe aloud, a dead thing no different from the rest. The work of preparing his remains began before the sun had risen on the 29th of January. 1547, the royal embalmers entered the chamber with faces stiff and gloves soaked in oils. They were not ready. No one could have been. The king's stomach was distended to a grotesque size. His face had swollen so much, it resembled a mask of suet. His legs, long torn open by ulcers, had blackened to the bone. When they removed the linens, the stench struck them like a blow. Several men turned away to vomit. One fainted. The rest remained, because they had to. It was not only a ritual, it was a duty, a political necessity, and a race against decomposition. His internal organs were removed with blades and iron spoons, placed into jars, and buried separately. The embalmers filled his chest cavity with spices, sawdust, sweet-smelling herbs, and old methods passed down from dead kings long past. But even those ancient arts could not keep pace with the rapid collapse of Henry's body. His liver had disintegrated to a soft pulp. His heart was grotesquely swollen. His bowels had already begun to liquefy. They sewed the body shut in silence, then sealed it with pitch and wrapped it in bandages, soaked in camphor and wine. Then came the coffin. It had to be made twice as wide as any nobleman's. The carpenters reinforced it with extra iron braces, thick planks, and a lining of lead. When the lid was closed, it hissed from the pressure, but it would not hold, not forever. As the corpse lay in state inside Whitehall Chapel, the lead-lined coffin began to bulge. Rumours spread that it groaned at night. By the third evening, fluids were seen seeping from a corner. A dark syrup dripped onto the chapel floor beneath the coffin, and before the priests could intervene, a dog wandered in. The animal sniffed the air, padded toward the box, and began licking the liquid that had once been a king. A servant screamed. The animal was removed. The mess was cleaned in haste, but the stain remained. And so did the whisper of blasphemy. The court covered it up. The priests held tighter to their incense. Guards stood closer to the coffin, but nothing could undo what had been seen. Henry VIII, defender of the faith, executioner of queens, founder of England's own church, had dripped through his own funeral box and fed the tongues of dogs. And yet, the procession had to continue. The king must be buried. His people must see majesty, not rot. On the 16th of February, the funeral train left London. A spectacle of black horses, trumpets, and velvet. The roads were cleared. The air hung thick with smoke. At the front rode heralds in mourning dress. Behind them, the massive coffin, pulled by a specially reinforced carriage, swayed under its own monstrous weight. And atop it, in place of the man inside, stood a wax figure, young, proud, and slim, wearing Henry's crown and robes as he had appeared decades earlier. The figure stood tall. The real Henry, decaying beneath layers of lead and herbs, did not. The journey to Windsor Castle took days. Along the road, villagers wept, or knelt, or whispered. Some blessed themselves. Others turned away. The myth of Henry was being buried alongside the man, and no one knew whether to mourn or exhale. Inside the royal carriage, perfumed cloths were stuffed into every crack. It did nothing. The guards escorting the coffin wore masks soaked in lavender and vinegar. Still they gagged. Still they prayed for cold weather. When the procession reached Windsor, St. George's Chapel was waiting. The stone floor had been cleared. The tomb beside Jane Seymour, Henry's third wife, the only one to give him a son, was open. The ceremony was quick. The effigy was removed. The coffin was lowered. The air inside the chapel was so thick with incense that it blurred the windows. Priests chanted, "Noble bowed." The tomb was sealed, and behind those sealed stones lay not a king in glory, but a body that had terrified its caretakers. Henry had planned a monument enormous, breathtaking, grotesque in its ambition. 40 bronze statues, a great equestrian figure of himself, towering above all others. A temple to his power and majesty. He had commissioned designs, chosen the marble, given orders that it must dwarf every royal tomb in England. It was never built. The money ran out. The bronze was melted down in the civil wars that followed. The tomb was left half done, then forgotten. And so the king who had obsessed over his image, who had broken from Rome to control how he would be remembered, ended up beneath a simple stone slab. No statues, no towering likeness, no crown, just bones, just rot, just the memory of blood. Back in London, the cleanup began. The chamber where he died was stripped, scrubbed, burned. His last nightshirt, soaked with blood and pus, was ceremonially destroyed under Cranmer's orders. The bed was dismantled, the tapestries removed, the windows left open for weeks. But the smell lingered. Rumours began to spread. Servants claimed they heard groans at night. One maid swore the king's face appeared in the fireplace. Soot? Another refused to enter the room at all. And as England stepped forward into a new reign, a new protectorate, a new boy king who was already a puppet to his uncle's ambitions, Henry lay silent. The dogs had licked his blood. The corpse had burst its bounds. The wax figure had stood in his place. And nothing, no tomb, no legacy, no prayer could rewrite how his reign had ended. In rot, in silence, in fear, death did not silence Henry VIII. It simply changed the room in which he gave orders. The man who had ruled with an iron voice and a sharper axe left behind more than a rotting body and a trail of ruined lives. He left behind a document, 30 pages of commands, corrections, crossed out names and careful signatures. His final will, it was a map drawn in ink and fear, a map that tried to chart the future of England long after its king had ceased to breathe. But even in death, Henry could not stop what was coming. Not the betrayals, not the erasures, not the quiet ways the women around him slipped out from under his shadow and started writing their own endings. The will was a weapon. It named his son Edward first, and foremost Edward. The 9-year-old boy he had torn through 6 marriages to produce. The boy who had barely known him. The boy who was already being handled, polished, and posed by the Seymour faction before the corpse in Whitehall, even cooled. Henry had tried to prevent that. He had named a council of 16 men, no single regent, no one lord to hold too much power. Balance, control, fear of ambition. It lasted 3 days. By the time Henry's death was announced, Edward Seymour had already seized power. He made himself Lord Protector. He sidelined the other councillors. He moved fast, ruthlessly, and with the cold efficiency of a man who had been preparing for this moment for years. Henry's beautifully crafted Regency Council became a footnote. His fear of tyranny, his obsession with control brushed aside with a signature. From the grave. Henry had also attempted to shape the future by naming his daughters. Mary, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, came next in line after Edward. Then Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn. It was a radical act. Both girls had once been declared illegitimate. He had written them out, then written them back in, as if lineage could be rewritten like a ledger. He gave them titles, promises, the throne itself. If Edward died without heirs, but the throne is no promise. It is a battlefield. Mary was 31 when her father died, devoutly Catholic, dignified, alone. She had spent her girlhood being shunned by her father, watching her mother be cast aside and die in isolation. She had endured the public humiliation of being forced to sign documents denying her mother's marriage, her own legitimacy, her God. And yet, she had survived. Now, with Edward on the throne and Protestant men whispering in his ear, Mary saw her faith under siege again. She kept her head bowed. She dressed in black. She smiled when summoned. But she kept her rosary close, and her supporters closer. Elizabeth was only 13, a girl still learning when to speak and when to disappear. She had the red hair of her mother, the quick eyes, the dangerous mind, but she was surrounded by people who remembered Anne Boleyn, people who watched her like a hawk, waiting for her to stumble. She moved carefully through court. She studied every glance. She learned how not to flinch. And she learned one more thing. Silence was a kind of armor. Their half-brother, Edward VI, did not see them as sisters. He saw them as pieces in a larger game. He had been taught to rule like a scholar, not a soldier. His tutors drilled him in scripture and kingship. His uncle guided his every move. And the 2 girls who stood just beyond the throne, girls who might one day wear the crown, were kept in check by letters, by visits monitored, by whispers about their legitimacy. And then there was the widow, Katherine Parr, Henry's 6th and final queen. The survivor, the educated one, the one who had managed to outlive the most dangerous husband in England's history. She wore her grief in public like a veil. quoting scripture, arranging memorials, overseeing the funeral rites with perfect devotion. But privately, she moved fast. In secret, she reconnected with the man she had loved before, Henry Thomas Seymour, brother to the new Lord Protector. Within months, she had married him, quietly, boldly, without waiting for court approval. It was a scandal, a whispering scandal, but no one dared speak it aloud. Katherine, for the first time in years, was free. No more ulcers, no more rage, no more bedchambers filled with screams and poison. She turned her home into a sanctuary for scholars and girls, Elizabeth among them, and it was here, in that brief space between Henry's death and the disasters to come, that something remarkable happened. Women began to breathe again, but the shadow of Henry lingered. In Parliament, in church, in every coin bearing his swollen face, his laws remained intact. His break with Rome still defined the English church. His taste for control still shaped policy. His death had changed everything, but nothing had changed quite enough. And then, the rumours started. Some said his ghost haunted Whitehall, that the room where he died grew cold every January, that a shadow would pass across the fireplace even when no one stood there. That dog still licked the stone where his coffin leaked. Superstition. Perhaps, but what was superstition in a country whose king had once declared himself God's voice on earth? In truth, it wasn't Henry's ghost that haunted England. It was his legacy. A divided court, a bankrupt treasury, a religious identity split down the middle. The selling of church lands had enriched the nobles, but left the poor adrift. The wars had emptied the coffers. The currency was debased, and a 9-year-old boy sat on a throne built by blood. Henry had tried to write the future. He had tried to control it. But the world was already slipping beyond his reach. And those he had ruled, his wife, his daughters, his enemies were already rewriting the next chapter in ink, far darker than his. The king was dead, but the consequences of his life were just beginning. What Henry VIII left behind was not a church. It was a battlefield dressed in candles and Latin, a place where the bells of Catholicism rang alongside Protestant psalms, where crucifixes still hung above altars even as their meanings shifted beneath the eyes of frightened priests. He had torn England away from Rome, not because he believed in reformation, but because he wanted to be its god, and in doing so, he left his people with a broken map of faith, full of contradictions, fear, and the kind of confusion that clings to every corner of a dying man's conscience. In the final weeks of his life, Henry vacillated wildly. One day, he demanded a Latin mass sung over his bed, incense burning, monks in black. The next, he ordered the Book of Psalms, read in English, the Latin forbidden. His chaplains recorded these shifts with nervous ink. His physicians made no comment, but the courtiers noticed. The servants whispered. They had seen him rise in the night, trembling from dreams, claiming to have been visited by the ghosts of Thomas More and Anne Boleyn, not speaking, only watching, eyes full of judgment. And behind the horror in those dreams was a deeper question. Had he damned his soul, he had named himself supreme head of the Church of England. He had closed the monasteries. He had burned men for clinging to the Pope, and burned others for denying the sacraments. He had danced between doctrines, rewriting scripture to suit his will. He banned the Pope, but he never let go of Catholic ritual. He spoke of salvation, but clung to confession. His court sang Protestant hymns in the morning and lit Catholic candles at night. And when he died, that confusion did not die with him. Edward VI, the boy king, was raised under strict Protestant tutelage. His mind was filled with Calvin, not Clement. His uncle, Edward Seymour, now Lord Protector, moved fast to cleanse the kingdom of what he saw as Henry's religious half-measures. The Latin Mass was outlawed. The Book of Common Prayer was written in English, placed on every altar. Priests married. Altars were stripped. Images were smashed. Churches whitewashed. The smells and bells were gone. And for those who had lived their entire lives, believing in the miracle of transubstantiation, it felt like betrayal cloaked in holy cloth. Mary watched all of this from the shadows of her own household. The daughter of Catherine of Aragon, raised in the old faith, she kept a private chapel. She heard Mass in secret. She refused the Book of Common Prayer, and with every breath, she became a symbol. To the old Catholics, she was hope. To the new Protestants, she was a threat. Elizabeth, barely a teenager, to walk to razor's edge between the two worlds. Born of Anne Boleyn, the woman whose Protestant sympathies had helped forge the English break from Rome, Elizabeth had no choice but to perform loyalty. And yet, she was smart enough to see that loyalty could be fatal. She kept her opinions hidden, her prayers silent, her gestures carefully choreographed. In a kingdom where faith could cost a head, Elizabeth practiced the most sacred survival tactic of all: ambiguity. And so the kingdom turned. Old churches stood empty. Monks became beggars. Nuns vanished into obscurity or fled abroad. Parishioners sat in silence, confused, watching priests fumble through English prayers they did not believe in. Henry had planted the seeds of Reformation, but they were wild, chaotic, and grew in directions he had never intended. His theology had been rooted in control. What followed was a fire he could not have contained even if he were still alive. His legacy was hijacked by both sides. Protestants pointed to his rejection of the Pope, his seizure of abbey lands, his destruction of relics. Catholics, especially those abroad, painted him as a regretful tyrant who had died murmuring prayers to the Virgin. Surrounded by guilt, neither side told the whole truth. The truth was messier, that in the end, Henry VIII did not die a Catholic or a Protestant. He died as a man who had made religion into a mirror of himself, flexible, terrifying, and always absolute. The people of England felt the whiplash. For 4 decades, their faith had been whatever Henry said it was. Now they were told it had all been wrong, that the Latin words no longer mattered, that the images of saints they had prayed to must be destroyed, that the dead they had buried in hope were not resting in the right theology. Fear gripped the countryside. In some towns, parishioners refused to enter the churches at all. In others, they tore pages from the new prayer books and burned them in secret. But fear did not only belong to the poor. Inside the court, noble families made dangerous choice. Some bet on the new religion, attending sermons about grace and scripture. Others kept the old mass alive behind closed doors. Some tried to walk both roads. Many failed. Arrests were made. Trials held. A few burnings conducted, not as many as under Mary, but enough to remind the kingdom that doctrine could be deadly. And beneath it all, Henry's ghost remained. Not a literal ghost, though many whispered they had seen him in Whitehall, but the shadow of his authority. People still asked, what would Henry have done? What would Henry have allowed? No one knew. Not really. Because Henry had made religion a weapon, not a belief. And once the hand holding that weapon was gone, the kingdom didn't know what to believe anymore. His tomb, unfinished and ignored, became a strange symbol of it all. The statues he had planned, bronze saints and angels towering over his bones, were never cast. The equestrian figure he had designed to sit above the entire crypt was never built. The grand project was quietly abandoned. The money went elsewhere. And the king who had split the Christian world in two now lay forgotten beneath a plain slab of stone, while England prayed in a language he had both banned and blessed. By the year 1549, just 2 years after Henry's death, the English church had changed beyond recognition. The boy on the throne no longer resembled the father in the grave. And across Europe, Catholic rulers watched England with a mixture of horror and hunger, wondering whether a child's kingdom could be reclaimed for Rome, or whether Henry's ghost would keep the door locked forever. But Henry was not God, and England had not yet chosen what to become. The man had rotted, the corpse had leaked, the king had died afraid. And yet, within weeks of Henry VIII's burial, his image returned, untouched, triumphant and defiant, not in flesh. In paint, across England, portraits began to reappear, not of the bloated, dying monarch who had screamed through his last days in Whitehall, but of the golden god he had once claimed to be, square-jawed, broad-shouldered, glaring down from the canvas with the unshakable confidence of a man who had never begged for morphine, never soiled his bed, never cried out for dead wives in the dark. This was not remembrance. It was resurrection by design. The myth of Henry had to live, even if the man had died howling. The image most people know today, the wide stance, fists on hips, a codpiece like a declaration of war, jewels dripping from every corner of his tunic, was not painted during Henry's final years. It was crafted years earlier by Hans Holbein, the German artist who understood better than most that kings were not painted as they were, but as they needed to be, and that image, the myth of might, became the shield England needed in the uncertain days after the king's death. Because the boy on the throne was no titan, he was a child, pale, quiet, controlled by uncles, surrounded by enemies, and England was watching, so they resurrected Henry, not as he died, but as he had once terrified the world into kneeling. In court ceremonies, nobles bowed to Edward's empty throne before he entered as they had to his father. They mimicked Henry's rituals. They posed Edward in portraits that echoed his father's famous stance. The crown was too large for his head, but the posture was trained, the glare practiced. England was not ready to bury Henry, so they painted over the body, and the propaganda spread. Pamphlets described Henry as England's Moses, leading the people out of Catholic darkness. Poets praised his justice, his strength, his unmatched will. Sermons called him the hammer of the papacy. Even his cruelty was rewritten into virtue. He had not murdered wives. He had protected the realm from traitors. He had not destroyed monasteries. He had cleansed corruption. He had not died in filth. He had ascended in glory. Behind closed doors, of course, the truth squirmed like something half-buried. Servants still spoke of the dogs licking at the leaked coffin. Physicians still remembered the stench, the ulcers, the madness. But none of that appeared in the public records. None of it reached the common people. What they saw was a legend, a printed face, a king carved in marble and myth. But myths are tools, and tools are dangerous. Edward Seymour, now Lord Protector, wielded Henry's legacy like a sword. He claimed to speak for the king's wishes. He cited the will when convenient. He ignored it when not. When resistance emerged, he invoked Henry's name. When reformers pushed too far, he invoked Henry's authority to rein them in. The dead king became a ventriloquist's doll, his mouth moved by other men, his memory used to silence dissent. And in homes across England, families hung paintings of Henry over their hearths, not out of love, but out of fear, because to speak ill of him was still dangerous. Even in death, he inspired obedience. Even in rot, he ruled. But not everyone believed the story. There were those who had known him in his final year, those who had heard his screams, those who had seen his legs black, cracked, oozing. They knew the cost of that image. They knew that beneath the velvet and gold, there had been a man whose body had collapsed under the weight of his appetites. They whispered that it was not godliness that carried him to the grave, but disease, madness, and decay. And slowly, a second image of Henry began to form, in private letters, in foreign accounts, in secret recollections. A French ambassador described him as a dying lion with maggots in his belly. A Spanish courtier called him a shadow who bled through the floor. A maid who served him in his final weeks wrote that she no longer feared the king, for he had become something less than a man. These were not words to print, but they survived. They drifted between households like smoke, and over time, they seeded a different legend, the legend not of glory, but of consequence. The man who had broken with Rome, who had made himself a god-king, had died, terrified of judgment. The man who had redefined marriage had died alone, with no wife beside him. The man who had demanded absolute obedience had died in a room where no one dared speak his name aloud. And yet, his paintings glared on, his statues still stood. His name was still spoken in Parliament as a seal of legitimacy. The myth could not be buried, even when the corpse had bloated beyond its coffin. But the children knew. Mary, Elizabeth, and even Edward each would come to understand, in their own way, the weight of a father who had tried to control the future by becoming more than a man. Each would face rebellion, treason, bloodshed. Each would have to decide whether to continue the lie or undo it. Edward would be young, still speaking in his father's tones. Mary would try to return to the old faith, invoking the mother Henry had discarded. Elizabeth would take the myth and wear it like armor, wielding the image while hiding the wounds beneath it. But that would come later. For now, in the year 1547, Henry was dead. The kingdom wore his face like a mask, and the throne, though occupied by a boy, still looked back with the eyes of a ghost. The bells rang late. The announcement came carefully worded, wrapped in ritual and diplomacy. The king is dead. No cause, no details. No mention of ulcers, rot, or royal flesh leaking onto chapel floors. Only the proclamation that Henry VIII had passed into eternity and that his beloved son Edward had ascended, guided by the light of divine succession. But beyond England's shores, far from Whitehall and its perfumed lies, the world was already watching and wondering, not just if the king was dead, but if England itself might finally fall. The first ripple reached Rome. Pope Paul III, the very man who had excommunicated Henry more than a decade earlier, responded in a gesture that baffled his cardinals. He ordered a mass for Henry's soul, a soul he had once declared severed from God, a man he had named a heretic, a blasphemer, a tyrant in schism. And yet, the Pope chose prayer, not for reconciliation, not for forgiveness, but for politics, because in death, Henry's weight still mattered, and the boy who sat on the throne now, Edward VI, was 9 years old, Protestant in training, and vulnerable in every way that kings should never be. Across the continent, ambassadors scratched ink into parchment, sending dispatches soaked in curiosity, suspicion, and quiet hunger. In France, King Francis I reportedly mourned, "My brother of England," he called Henry. Despite their battles, despite the insults, the wars, the broken treaties, but beneath the public grief was calculation. France had watched England for decades through clenched teeth and spyglasses, and now they saw a kingdom held together by a child's spine and a council full of wolves. In the Holy Roman Empire, Emperor Charles V, nephew to Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first discarded queen, took the news with cold eyes. He asked one question: "Is England Catholic again?" The answer was no. And so he sharpened his pens, his alliances, his armies, Europe, for all its prayers and processions, understood something. England was pretending not to Henry's death, created a power vacuum, a vacuum too dangerous to leave alone. In Ireland, rebellion smouldered beneath the soil. In Scotland, the border clans sniffed weakness. And in Spain, court whispers began to flutter like dark wings. What if Edward died? What if Mary rose? What if England returned to the true church, but Edward did not die yet? And his protectors moved swiftly. Edward Seymour locked down the ports, strengthened garrisons, filled the boy king's court with loyal voices. And all the while, he invoked Henry's name like a spell. Every edict bore the authority of the late king's will. Every threat carried the weight of Henry's imagined blessing. But outside England, no one feared that name anymore. They remembered the bloated corpse, the split coffin, the silence of the bells. They remembered that a true king did not need his son protected by regents. A true king ruled until the last breath. Even in the Netherlands, Catholic merchants paused. Would England remain friendly to trade? Would Protestant zeal burn their ships? Would Mary bring them back to Rome? Uncertainty was everywhere. And uncertainty, to foreign powers, smelled like blood. At the edges of empire, whispers turned to plans. There were maps drawn, ships counted, embassies shuffled. Diplomats offered condolences with eyes full of calculation. Some even dared to suggest privately that now was the time to reclaim the souls of the English people. The Pope commissioned new envoys. Jesuits began writing letters to English nobility. In hidden corners of the countryside, old priests dusted off Latin altars and waited. And yet, the invasion never came, because even in death, Henry's reforms held, not because they were holy, but because they had created new kings beneath the skin of the kingdom, landowners who had enriched themselves with seized abbey lands, nobles whose fortunes now depended on Protestant rule, merchants who had profited from the shift away from Rome. These men had no love for Edward Seymour, but they had less love for the Pope, and so they clung to the boy king, not out of loyalty, but out of necessity. Meanwhile, in England itself, the death felt quiet. The people did not riot. The markets did not close. There was no apocalyptic wailing in the streets. Instead, there was unease. Parish records from early 1547 mention strange sightings. A comet over York, a bleeding host in a forgotten chapel, children born with teeth, crows gathering on cathedral roofs. Superstition rose where certainty had died. For the common folk, Henry's death felt like the end of an era too massive to mourn all at once. He had ruled for nearly 40 years. He had been the sun around which everything orbited law. Marriage, money, morality, and now, that sun had gone cold, leaving only the chill of confusion. They remembered him not as he had been in death, but as they had been taught to remember the strong man, the judge, the hand of God. They knew nothing of the ulcers, nothing of the ghosts, nothing of the dogs. They knew only that their prayers now sounded different, that their priests now wore different robes, that their taxes now went to different men, and so the world turned. Across the Channel, kings and popes waited to see if England would collapse. Inside England, nobles waited to see who would fall first. And beneath the stone floor of St. George's Chapel in Windsor, the body of Henry VIII swelled in silence. The gas still building in the sealed lead coffin. The bronze statues he had dreamed of, never cast. The tomb he had designed half forgotten. A king buried with half his legend and none of his glory. But even in death, he held the eyes of the world. Because they knew, everyone knew that what came next would not be peace. It would be succession, war, fire, and perhaps, someday, the return of a daughter who would rule like no man ever had. History says Henry VIII died in January of the year 1547, but that is only when his body failed. His presence lingered far longer, threaded through laws, stitched into prayers, carved into ceilings, and worst of all, haunting the hearts of his children like a curse that refused to pass. He had tried to make himself immortal, not through kindness, not through love, but through control, and the iron grip he kept in life clenched just as tightly from the grave. Mary, the daughter he once banished for defending her mother, rose first. She was 31 when her father died, a woman who had once been forced to sign papers denying her mother's marriage, her own legitimacy, and the Pope she worshipped. She signed them with tears in her eyes and fury in her bones. Henry had stolen her title, her mother, her religion, but he had not broken her. When Edward VI died young, just 6 years after his father, Mary reclaimed her crown, like a woman setting fire to a prison. She rode into London surrounded by banners bearing the Virgin's image. She heard Mass in Latin. She ordered the bells to ring not for her glory, but for God's. And then she began to burn people. The burnings were not quick. They were not few. Hundreds of Protestants were tied to stakes under her reign. She said it was to restore the soul of England. She said it was what her father would have wanted. But somewhere behind the flames, behind the veils, behind the flicker in her eyes, was the echo of Henry himself, a monarch trying to force belief with iron and fire. She died in pain, childless, fevered, heartbroken, her body ravaged by illness and regrets. And when the crown passed to Elizabeth, there was no ceremony of peace, only a shift in the wind. A daughter had replaced her sister, a daughter Henry never held, a daughter he had barely acknowledged. And yet Elizabeth remembered everything. She remembered her mother's name, whispered like poison. Anne Boleyn, the wife who was never supposed to be queen, the queen who became a corpse in the Tower before Elizabeth was old enough to speak. She remembered being declared illegitimate. She remembered being used, accused, questioned, locked away. She remembered learning that her father had murdered her mother with a stroke of a quill and the nod of an executioner. But Elizabeth did not take revenge. She became myth, in the quiet, the sharp way of women who have learned never to show fear. Elizabeth took the crown and remade the legend. She did not marry. She did not share power. She did not burn for doctrine. She burned for loyalty. And though she rarely spoke his name, she ruled like him in pageantry, in paranoia, in power, and yet unlike him, she knew how to wear the crown without letting it crush her. She kept a portrait of Henry in her private chambers. Not the dying one. The one painted by Holbein, the one where he stood like a god. And sometimes, they said, when she stood alone in that room, facing her father's image, she would stare for minutes without moving, as if waiting, as if remembering, as if daring him to speak. But he never did. His legacy lived in her stained, sharpened, reimagined. Where Henry had ruled with hunger, Elizabeth ruled with illusion. Where Henry had executed wives, Elizabeth never married. Where Henry had made religion a blade, Elizabeth made it a compromise. She found the balance her father never could. She made peace with the ghosts. But the country could not forget. In churches, the echoes of his Reformation lingered. In families, the pain of burned abbeys and stolen lands. In hearts, the fear that rulers could change the soul of a nation with a signature. And beneath Windsor's stone floor, Henry still lay, the coffin still sealed, the tomb still unfinished, the marble still cold. They say that no monarch in English history left a deeper mark, that no man redefined a nation more completely in life and death. But the truth is simpler. Enquete. He did not change England. He broke it. And his children Mary, Elizabeth, and the forgotten Edward spent their lives trying to piece it back together with trembling hands. In the end, there were no statues, no shining tomb, no resurrection, only stories of a man whose pain consumed him, of a king who made fear his legacy, of a father whose daughters rose from the ashes of his cruelty, wearing crowns he never wanted them to wear, and of a country that learned too late that power, once fed by blood, never forgets the taste.